Welcome back to Ancient Echoes, where myth becomes memory and the stories of the ancient world still speak. I'm Chelsea, and in this episode, we're leaving the city walls and stepping into something older, deeper, and more enduring than bronze or marble. We're entering into the realm of epic poetry, the great songs of war and wandering, of gods and men, of rage, honor, and homecoming. We're talking about Homer and the twin pillars of Greek literary tradition, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were education. They were identity. Before Greece had history, it had heroes. Before it had philosophy, it had epic. In a world where few could read and fewer still could write, poetry was power. It preserved memory. It carried values across generations, and it shaped the very way the Greeks understood themselves. Who are we? Why do we fight? What do we owe to our friends, our families, our gods? And what does it mean to be remembered? These were the questions at the heart of every epic. And so today we'll explore how the Greeks used words to make sense of war and how even now we still turn to these same stories when we're searching for meaning. First, let's set the stage. What exactly is an epic? And why did the Greeks tell their greatest truths, not in argument, but in song? Long before the Greeks built temples to Athena or debated justice in the agora, they gathered around fires and listened to the voice of the bard. Epic poetry was the soul of early Greek culture. It was how stories were passed down, how values were taught, and how memories outlived the people who made them. These weren't written texts, carefully edited and published. They were living performances, crafted in rhythm and didactic hexameter, a kind of poetic meter that made the words easier to memorize and deliver aloud. Think of it like a lyrical code, part music, part story, part ceremony. The Greek word for poet is poietes, which means maker, and in a world where most knowledge was passed orally, poets were makers not just of stories, but of identity, history, and meaning. At the heart of this tradition stood one towering, almost mythic figure, Homer. We don't know for sure if Homer was one man, many men, or even a name given to a tradition rather than a person. What we do know is that two epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, came to define the Greek imagination. They were recited, not read, often over multiple days in royal courts, public festivals, or informal gatherings. These performances were the ancient equivalent of a blockbuster trilogy, history class, and sacred ritual, all rolled into one. And because they were passed down through generations of oral poets before ever being written down, they're filled with what scholars call formulaic language, phrases and epithets that repeat over and over, like swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered Dawn. These weren't lazy repetitions, they were poetic tools. They kept the rhythm, filled the meter, and gave the bard breathing room to remember what came next. But these stories weren't just for entertainment. They were instructional. Epic poetry taught people what it meant to be Greek, what it meant to be human. It was their Bible, their Shakespeare, their Marvel Cinematic Universe, but with fewer capes and more sandals. Through these epics, listeners learned about honor and lasting glory, shame and communal reputation, hospitality and the sacred bond between guest and host, hubris and the danger of overstepping your mortal place, and the ever-present tension between fate and free will. Epic poetry didn't just tell stories, it transmitted a worldview, a shared mythic lens through which the Greeks understood heroism, suffering, and the divine. And the stories that shaped that lens most profoundly, they weren't just about gods, they were about people. Angry, flawed, clever, loyal, wounded people, trying to find their place in a world that often felt like a battlefield. Let's begin then where Greek literature begins, with a man full of rage, a war nearing its end, and a question that still haunts us today. What is the cost of glory? Next up, the Iliad. Sing, goddess of the rage of Achilles. So begins the Iliad. Not with the beginning of the war, not with the gods or armies, but with rage. And not just any rage, the kind of rage that bends kingdoms, destroys friendships, desecrates bodies, and makes even the gods lean in to watch. This isn't just a story about war, it's a story about what war does to the human soul. The story unfolds during the 10th year of the Trojan War, a legendary conflict between the Achaeans, or the Greeks, and the people of Troy, sparked years earlier by the elopement or abduction of Helen, the Queen of Sparta, by Paris, a Trojan prince. But the Iliad doesn't cover the entire war. It zooms in on just a few intense weeks near its end. At the center is Achilles, the Greeks' greatest warrior, who becomes furious when his commander, Agamemnon, takes away Briseis, a woman Achilles had claimed as a war prize. In a culture built on status and pride, this isn't just a personal insult. It's a public humiliation. In response, Achilles does the unthinkable. He withdraws from battle, leaving the Greeks to suffer without their fiercest fighter. As the Trojans, led by the noble Hector, press the advantage, the Greeks begin to lose ground. Eventually, Achilles allows his beloved companion Patroclus to wear his armor and lead the troops in his place. Patroclus fights bravely but is killed by Hector. When Achilles learns of Patroclus's death, his grief transforms back into rage, this time unstoppable. He returns to the battlefield, slays Hector, and in a final act of fury, drags Hector's body around the walls of Troy again and again. But the poem doesn't end with revenge. In a quiet, powerful moment, King Priam, Hector's father, comes to Achilles' tent and begs for his son's body. Achilles, moved by the old king's grief, returns the corpse and grants a temporary truce for mourning. The poem ends not with victory, but with a funeral. At first glance, the Iliad looks like a war story, but Homer doesn't glorify war, he exposes it. This is a story about what war does to people, to their pride, their friendships, their judgment, and their souls. Achilles is the most powerful warrior, but also the most fragile. His dilemma is one of fate. He can die young in glory or live a long, forgettable life. And in that choice lies one of the most enduring questions of human history. Is it better to be remembered or to be happy? Hector, on the other hand, fights not for fame, but for family. He knows he can't win, but he fights anyway, out of duty and love. But the Iliad doesn't end with death. It ends with something rarer than rage: compassion. Hector's father, King Priam, sneaks into the Greek camp and begs Achilles to return his son's body. Achilles listens. He sees not a king, but a father. He sees his own lost father reflected in the trembling hands of his enemy. And in that moment, the rage lifts, the gods watch silently, and in the end, we get a moment of unexpected grace. Two grieving men, from opposite sides of the war, weeping together in the night. No politics, no gods, just shared sorrow. And that, Homer seems to say, is what makes us human. Not our victories, but our ability to feel for one another, even in the midst of ruin. So what is the Iliad about? Yes, war and rage, but also helos, or glory, the central value in Homeric society, earned through battle, but sometimes paid in blood. Also hubris, or pride. Achilles' downfall is his pride. His rage blinds him to the suffering of others, even those he loves. We also have fate and free will. The gods may meddle, but the heroes still make choices, and sometimes they're terrible ones. Honor and shame. Every decision is made in the eyes of the community. What others think of you defines your worth. And compassion, a rare and radical theme by the end. Achilles' final act is not of war, but of mercy. Achilles is no perfect hero. He's powerful, but volatile. Brutal, but reflective. And in him, we see a reflection of our own potential for both destruction and redemption. And now, as the smoke of Troy still lingers in our minds, we follow a different kind of hero. Not the strongest, but the cleverest. Not seeking glory, but home. Up next, the Odyssey and the long, winding road home. If the Iliad is about war, the Odyssey is about what happens after. It's about wandering, longing, and the reinventing yourself after everything familiar has been torn away. The Odyssey is the story of a man trying to get home, not just to a place, but to himself. The war at Troy is over. The Greeks have returned, most of them anyways, but Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, has not. For 10 years, he's been trapped in a cycle of storms, shipwrecks, curses, and detours, all while his wife Penelope and son Telemachus wait and wonder if he's even alive. Along the way, Odysseus encounters a cast of unforgettable obstacles. The lotus eaters, whose fruit makes men forget their home, the Cyclops Polyphemus, who Odysseus blinds, earning the wrath of Poseidon, the sorceress Circe, who turns his men into pigs, the sirens, whose song tempts sailors to their death, the monster Scylla, and the whirlpool Charybdis, between which Odysseus must sail. He also spends 7 years with the nymph Calypso, who offers him immortality if he stays. He refuses because immortality without home, without identity, isn't life at all. Eventually, after many trials, he washes ashore in Ithaca, alone, unrecognized, and forever changed. At its surface, the Odyssey is an adventure story, but at its core, it's a meditation on who we are when everything else is stripped away. Odysseus is cunning. He's known as the man of many ways, but that cleverness cuts both ways. Sometimes it saves him, sometimes it merely destroys him. Unlike Achilles, who seeks glory and death, Odysseus seeks survival. His goal isn't Kilos, it's Nostos, the return. And the journey changes him. By the time he gets home, he's not just reclaiming a throne, he's proving his identity to his son, to his wife, and even to himself. Because home isn't a place, it's a relationship, a memory, a promise you make to keep going, even when you've lost the map. Some themes to watch out for in the Odyssey are identity and disguise. Odysseus frequently hides who he is, often for protection, sometimes for strategy. But this raises a question. When do we truly know ourselves? We also see temptation and self-control. The Odyssey is full of temptations. Rest, luxury, pleasure, forgetfulness. Odysseus must resist or risk losing everything. We also see hospitality, just like in the Iliad. The sacred guest-host relationship defines how people treat one another. Odysseus encounters both good hosts and dangerous violators. We see the role of women. Penelope, Circe, Calypso, all are strong, varied portrayals of womanhood. Penelope especially is a model of patience, loyalty, and quiet resistance. We also see the last theme of homecoming and transformation. The return to Ithaca isn't a reset, it's a rebirth. Odysseus must reclaim not just his house, but his place in the world. So if the Iliad teaches us about glory, the Odyssey teaches us about endurance. It's not the blazing flash of a hero on the battlefield. It's the slow, salt-stained, hard-earned path of someone who just won't give up. It's a reminder that the journey home, wherever or whatever it is, may be long, but it's always worth it. Next, we'll zoom out to explore the mythic landscape itself, where gods play chess with mortals, where fate is a thread spun by divine hands, and where even heroes aren't immune to the whims of Olympus. They whisper in dreams, shift the tides, disguise themselves as strangers, toss storms at ships, and meddle in battles like cosmic stage moms who just can't stay off the field. And yet, they're not all powerful. They're not all good. They're not even all that emotionally stable, to be honest. They're petty, jealous, passionate, and deeply invested in human affairs. And that's what makes them so compelling. If you've ever read a group text thread that spiraled into chaos because one person just couldn't let something go, congratulations. You understand Mount Olympus. In the Iliad, the gods don't just watch the war. They pick sides. Athena supports the Greeks. Apollo fights for the Trojans. Hera is out for revenge. Zeus tries to stay neutral until he doesn't. Basically, it's divine Game of Thrones with lightning bolts. The gods reflect human emotion magnified. They don't create justice. They reflect it back to humans in messy, mythic ways. What's fascinating is how the line between mortal and immortal constantly blurs. The heroes are humans, yes, but they're also the children of gods or blessed by them or cursed by them. Achilles' mother is a sea goddess. Hector prays to Zeus. Helen is said to be the daughter of Zeus himself. Even the battles seem choreographed by divine hands. It raises the questions. How much of our fate is ours? And how much is just the gods playing dice with our destinies? In Homeric storytelling, mortals always think they're making choices until the gods show up, rearrange the plot, and call it divine will. It's essentially ancient literature's version of a plot twist. If the Iliad shows gods at war, the Odyssey shows gods as gatekeepers of fate. Poseidon is Odysseus's main antagonist, not because he's evil, but because Odysseus blinded his son, the Cyclops, which, fair point. Athena, ever the strategist, becomes Odysseus's divine BFF, sneaking him advice, disguising him when necessary, and pulling strings behind the scenes. And then there's Hermes, delivering messages like the world's fastest Amazon Prime driver, and Calypso, the immortal who just wants Odysseus to stay and chill on her island forever. Honestly, she offers him immortality, peace, and paradise, and he still says, "Sorry, I've got a wife and a kid at home." Odysseus may be the original #family man. But while the gods have power, they don't always have control. Even Zeus can't stop fate, and that's important. In Greek thought, the gods are part of the cosmic machinery, not above it. There's a tension between divine will and mortal action that runs through every line of Homer's poetry. So why are the gods so human? Because the Greeks weren't trying to create perfect deities. They were trying to make sense of the world that felt unpredictable, chaotic, and beautiful. By imagining gods who mirrored human flaws, they could explore the real questions. Why do good people suffer? Why do victories feel hollow? Why does love undo even the strongest? And how do we live in a world where the rules sometimes change mid-sentence? Homer's gods are not there to save us. They're there to test us, to remind us that even if the gods push us around, the choices we make still matter. That how we respond to fate, that's where meaning lives. And hey, if you happen to be clever enough to tie yourself to a mast so you don't jump into the sea after a siren, that's not just survival, that's character growth. Next, we'll step beyond the text and into the long shadows these epics cast. From Roman poets to Renaissance painters to pop culture heroes, how did the Iliad and the Odyssey become the foundation of Western storytelling? Let's talk about legacy. It's been over 2,700 years since a bard first sang the rage of Achilles and the wanderings of Odysseus. And yet, we're still telling these stories, still reading them, still teaching them. Why? Because the Iliad and the Odyssey didn't just shape Greek identity, they shaped Western storytelling as we know it. Think of them as the original franchise universe, only instead of spin-offs and streaming rights, we got Roman poets, Renaissance paintings, and an entire academic discipline called classics. The Greeks themselves treated Homer like scripture. Children learned to recite his lines, philosophers debated his morality, rhapsodies or professional performers traveled from city to city reciting passages at festivals. His epics were engraved in memory long before they were ever committed to stone or scroll. And the Romans? Well, they were huge fans. Virgil's Aeneid is basically Roman Homer fan fiction, with a Trojan hero escaping the fall of Troy, battling monsters, and founding the future Roman Empire. Even Alexander Great carried a copy of the Iliad with him, tucked under his pillow at night next to his dagger, which tells you everything you need to know about the ancient definition of light bedtime reading. Renaissance artists painted Achilles in all his wrathful glory. Baroque composers wrote operas about Odysseus's return. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, modern writers reimagined Homeric heroes in radically new ways. You have James Joyce's Ulysses is essentially the Odyssey set in a single day in Dublin. You have Madeline Miller's Circe, which gives voice to a sidelined sorceress. Even films like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, Troy, The Hunger Games owe debts to Homeric structure. Yes, even Katniss Everdeen has a touch of Achilles in her, brooding, fierce, and perpetually annoyed by authority. The hero's journey, the reluctant warrior, the long-awaited homecoming, Homer gave us that blueprint. These stories endure because they ask the questions that never go away. What makes a hero? What does it mean to be honorable? How do we carry our grief and still go on? Can you return home and still be the same person who left? The Iliad teaches us about the cost of pride. The Odyssey reminds us that survival is a form of heroism, too. And both epics suggest that memory, the stories we tell, is what gives our lives shape. And maybe that's the real reason Homer still echoes through our halls and classrooms. Not because the past is perfect, but because it's still speaking, still warning, still wondering. Next, we'll reflect on what the Greeks believed about language, story, and immortality, and why telling a story well might just be the greatest kind of power there is. So what do we make of it all? Two epics, one about rage and glory, one about home and survival. Together they form the twin pillars of a civilization that believed words could shape identity, forge memory, and outlive kings. For the ancient Greeks, stories weren't just entertainment, they were education, moral compass, and civic glue. They taught young citizens how to fight, how to lead, how to grieve, and how to live. And depending on the day, how to annoy the gods, just enough to get cursed, but not smited. The Greeks didn't believe that immortality came from gold or conquest. They believed it came from being remembered, and in that sense, Homer's heroes succeeded. Achilles still rages. Odysseus still sails. Penelope still waits. Because we're still listening, still retelling, still turning the same questions over in our minds, like smooth stones worn down by centuries of wondering. What is honor? What is home? What will I leave behind? Thanks for journeying with me into the heart of Greek epic. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend who loves history, and be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. In our next episode, we'll continue to dive deeper in our knowledge and understanding of ancient Greece. Until then, may your mind be sharp, your story honest, and your return, eventually, sweet.